I'm John Bowden from Rock History Canada, and we're honored to have a very special guest on our channel this week. One of the major players in the history of Canadian music, Frank Davies. Frank Davies is a key figure in the Canadian music industry. Many would say one of the most important of all time. He's known for his pivotal role as a music mogul, who helped shape the careers of a lot of prominent Canadian artists. Born in England, Davies moved to Canada in the late 1960s, where he became heavily involved in the music scene. In 1970, Davies founded Daffodil Records, one of Canada's first independent record labels. Under his leadership, the label signed influential Canadian acts like Afoot and Coldwater, Crowbar, and The Bells. Daffodil's early embrace of Canadian music really helped pave the way for the country's burgeoning music industry. Before that, many Canadian artists were struggling. Davies worked not just with label executives, but also as a producer and a music publisher. He helped establish the presence of Canadian music internationally by advocating stronger copyright laws. He also founded the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1998. Davies' influence also extended into production, where he was involved in several hits that crossed over into the international market, making him a vital bridge between Canadian music and the global stage. He was honored with the Juno Special Achievement Award in 2014, cementing his legacy as a real pioneer in Canada. Davies has received several accolades through the years for his hard work in promoting Canadian music. He's always been closely associated with the Juno Awards. In 2014, he was honored with the Walt Greeless Special Achievement Award at the Juno Awards. This one is given to individuals who made extraordinary contributions to the Canadian music industry. In this one, he was recognized as a music executive, producer, publisher, and advocate for Canadian talent. He's also been a passionate supporter of CanCon, a regulation which was introduced to promote Canadian music on radio and television. He's also received Lifetime Achievement honors and industry recognitions for his work in shaping the Canadian music landscape. I look at your career and I'm going, through the years, I mean, you're like a train. You just kept going and going. I know how many boards and how many things you've done for Canadian music, but let me start with this. How is it that what is it in you that just got things, you did it? You were acting like a guy who did his homework on Friday night, not Sunday night.
It's hard to say. It's both a love of what I do and what I've been doing all this time. And I guess it's a form of discipline too. I mean, I went to Naval College, and you get into a sort of rhythm of things have to be done. There's no putting them off or delays or whatever. That's the way it works. And of course, after 4 years there, I decided, no, this isn't for me. I'd already been just steeped in music, loved it. So it started there, and basically it's still the same. I mean, I'm 77, and I have no plans to stop. And, I've just this last year finished 2 or 3 albums that I've executive produced and I publish, and a number of other writers and artists I represent. So no, it's going to continue on. And as long as I hear something that really excites me and, just reaches right in and says, I've got to be involved, I'll stay involved. And, at the same time, I'm continuing on with the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame that I started. And that takes not a lot of time now, but enough time to warrant, being careful about allocating enough resources to be able to do that. And I always was in love with it. I had a subscription to Billboard when I was 14. So I was in England at the time, and I took out a subscription because I already loved the whole concept of both the music industry and the music that drove it. And I was a huge fan, and there were only 2 non-industry subscribers in England at the time to Billboard, because, it cost a lot of money. I mean, it was my whole pocket money was basically went to my Billboard subscription. And there was one other person who happened to be a friend of mine who likewise was just in love with music. and the industry aspect of it too, which is not just, okay, every kid loves music, of course, but I was really excited by the whole concept of the industry, which of course I knew absolutely nothing about then, and how it all worked. I'm watching the charts and second guessing the charts, going, oh, that's not going to be a hit, but yeah, that is. And, watching with satisfaction something become a huge hit that I had early on thought, no, that's going to be big. And so, it started very early and it never left. And I did my 4 years at Naval Academy. And basically, the only way I got out of being able to, if you like, not do the up at 5 a.m., cleaning the washrooms, all of that sort of stuff, was playing the bugle. So by doing Reveille for all of the cadets at that point in time, I did not have to do latrine duty, and all of those other things. So, I knew by then this was it. I have to be in music.
When you left home, what were you listening to? When you left and said, Mom and Dad, I've got my pots and pans, I'm leaving, what kind of music were you into at that point?
Everything that I can't pigeonhole it. So everything that just really I loved, and it was everything from, and it was particularly, let's say, driven number one by Bob Dylan, who at about 15, I had been a huge Elvis fan. And then a friend of mine went to New York, another cadet at Naval Academy, went to New York over the summer break and brought back with him this album called Freewheeling, and listened to it, and basically my life changed. I mean, then that was the catalyst for saying, I've got to be involved in music industry, and I was in love with it, and still am to this day. So that was a big change. But I was listening to, Ella Fitzgerald, all of the great blues artists, because, the English really loved American blues. And that drove, obviously, as you know, Cream and Zeppelin and everybody you can think of in that period were driven by American black music and R&B and blues. And so I had a whole pile of Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon and you name it albums also. And one of the things when I went to university, which is, if you like, when I left home, I went to university in France and I applied to Billboard to be their correspondent because they didn't have one. And probably because I'd had an association with the English office, they turned me over to a woman in New York who said, sure, absolutely. Just give us reviews, weekly or monthly, on all the artists that come into your area that you can go to and review. And for every review you submit that we print, we will send you 12 LPs of your choice. So that's what I did during university. And I had so many of those artists came into town, a lot of the big French artists, because I was in France, but also all of, the French love jazz and they love blues. So all of those great artists like Ella Fitzgerald and others were coming into the area where my university was. And I'd write reviews and I was in heaven. I kept getting packages from the United States of 12 LPs of my choice. So I had quite a library even building up as I was at university because of all these reviews that were getting published in Billboard.
How did your family react to your career choice? And I mean, obviously it was you were taking chances, making major inroads. Your friends and family, how did they get it?
No, they were fine with it. I mean, they thought it was strange, and my father loved music, and particularly classical music, and so it was a little strange, this pop music world that was suddenly evolving, particularly in England, because as you know, that was the swinging '60s, and it was pretty wild out there, and for a generally conservative man, but with a lot of liberal tendencies. His reaction was weird, but hey, it's what he wants to do, and he's obviously, I guess, he saw that I was passionate about it, and when I got back from university, I applied to EMI Records in London, and they took me on as a management trainee, and so it began. And I guess for the next how many years was I in England? Then another 4 years between EMI Records, and then I went on to Liberty Records, an American label but based in London. Yeah, I mean, there was no controversy about it in the sense of, oh no, you mustn't do that. And I think they expected me probably to go down a different route. I think my father thought I'd be a diplomat because he felt that I was an objective listener. And
well, you kind of were a diplomat, though. You kind of had that software in what you do.
I think that's true, and I have had to use it over many years. And being on all these boards, of course, you've got to be very objective and try and see everybody's side of the picture, and try and bring people together. So it is a diplomatic role, and I think if he had lived longer, he died, pretty young, he would have been very pleased to see that. My mother was, because she lived a lot longer, and I guess the same with my sister, my older sister too.
Did you ever meet through the years the gentleman who introduced Elton to Bernie, Ray Williams?
I not only met him, I worked with him very closely for almost 2 years. There was a group of us at Liberty Records. Andrew Lauder, who was younger than Ray and I, actually, and we were young then. Andrew was head of A&R, and he basically went on, has had a great career, and just signed so many wonderful English bands like the Groundhog, Stone Roses, Man from Wales. I could list you a dozen of them. The Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, if you ever heard of them. Okay. So these bands, a lot of them, we signed at Liberty. And basically, there was a group of us that were the younger ones, which was Landrew, myself, and Ray Williams, were if you want, the music committee. I had nothing to do with Ray and the introduction. I was there when it happened. But Ray, I did see him want to take ads in the music papers. And our chief, our managing director, a man called Bob Reisdorf, he had come into London to establish Liberty Records as an independent label in Europe. And Bob had an incredible background. He owned a record label in California called Dolton, Dolton. Dolton had the Fleetwoods, Come Softly to Me, the Ventures, had a whole string of hits with the Ventures. He had some really good artists that were very successful. So the owner of Liberty Records bought his label. Al Bennett was the owner. He bought Dolton Records and then asked Bob to move over to England to run this new operation of his, Liberty Records Europe. So anyway, I remember Ray asking Bob, saying, I want to take a series of ads in the trades. Are you okay with that? Because I found this wonderful keyboard player, but he doesn't write lyrics. So yes, obviously he took them. He put them in the trades, got the response from NME. And actually, Ray and I have stayed in touch. And in fact, I spoke to him less than a year ago. But what I was particularly pleased to see, I don't know whether you saw the latest Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction concert. And if you did, you saw Elton, which was a really good, recognize Ray in that induction for Bernie. And he also talked about Liberty Records, which I thought was great because we were a real small fledgling label. We had 8 of us in the company, total staff of 8. And yeah, it was an incredible time. We signed some wonderful bands in that period. Also Family, if you remember a band called Family.
Mm-hmm.
Also we we represented all the American acts too. So it was a great time. Andrew and I were very good friends. We kept in touch right up to probably about 10 or 15 years ago. You know, he always listened to my acts and I listened to his, and it was the same with Ray. In fact, actually, Ray co-managed for a very brief period one of my bands in England, a band called A Foot in Coldwater. And I got a record deal for them with Island Records in England. And Ray and his partner, management partner, was a man called Robert Wace. And he and Robert loved A Foot in Coldwater, loved this particular record that I'd made the deal with the Island on. So they co-managed the band because I was looking for management for them. And I thought, well, I know Ray, let's see what he's up to. Well, he was managing the Kinks with Robert at the time. So they said, sure, let's take on your band. So they did. And so, yeah, Ray and I have stayed in touch regularly throughout all these years. He got into film, more and more into film music. Got a couple of Oscars for the scores he helped put together. And yeah, we were all young, virtually just past teenagers from the 60s that just kept on in music and, you know, had our own share of successes over the years.
John Anthony, by the way, I asked last night on my Facebook on a few of my groups as well if people had questions for you. And John Anthony came up and say hi for me. I produced the band Foot in Coldwater. That's all he said.
That's great. And, you know, I've lost touch with John. And I guess one of the downsides about not being on social media, because I'm not on any of it.
They bombard you, though. Wouldn't they bombard you, especially if you were on social media? Would you have time?
I think that was part of the problem. I did join very briefly, a very brief period, LinkedIn and Facebook. This was maybe even before Twitter, I think it was. And I was, you know, I found that I couldn't manage everything else that I was doing if I was devoting a lot of time to all of this. But the downside is that I don't know a lot of what my really good friends are up to, where they are, what they're doing, unless there's some news that hits the industry newsletters or Billboard or whatever it is. And John is a particular person I'd lost touch with, and he's great. I love him. And we had quite an experience doing that album because I'd done the first 2 Foot albums myself, and then got them signed to Elektra Asylum. And they said, who would you like to produce the record? And at that point, I wasn't ready to devote the time to doing it. And they basically said, you got your choice. Well, I was in love with the Trident sound at that point. What was coming out of Trident Studios, Gus Dudgeon, all of those records. And of course, John, yeah, right. And John was producing a lot of them, produced Genesis for them, Van de Graaff Generator. Just
Peter Hamill, yeah, with that. Yeah.
Was it Charisma? Am I thinking Charisma? Anyway, a guy called Tony Stratton Smith owned it and managed it. So I knew
It could have been
John.
charisma back then, yeah.
I think it was charisma. And so I knew of John well and knew what he was doing. And then, of course, knowing the Trident stuff he was up to, I said to Jack Holtzman, I would love it if John Anthony could do the record. And he had just done an Act 4 Electra, maybe it was Queen at that point. And they said, of course. And but we have a relationship with him and we'll get him on board. So John came up, I remember one mid-February winter's period to see the band. I drove him out of town for a couple of hours in a blinding snowstorm to go see them. And he loved them. And of course, he did the record.
Yeah, he did the first Queen album, which most people call the rock album, because the first one was really, they were a rock band for the most part.
They were.
How did the Klaatu thing, how did that materialize itself into your life?
Basically, as Terry probably told you, he and I are very good friends, and we go back all the way to when I arrived in Canada in 1970. He had already come here maybe 2 to 3 years before I did. And, you know, being a Brit and everything else, we sort of soon found each other. And we found each other very easily, too, because he basically had the only good studio in town that wasn't, if you want, a corporate studio, like an independent, really good studio. And so the very first thing I did coming into Canada was producing the Crowbar album. Well, actually, it was the King Biscuit Boy album, official music. And we did the demos. In fact, the demos had already been started at Terry's studio. So when I came in and I made a deal with Ronnie Hawkins as partners in the label and all of that, the very first project was the King Biscuit Boy and Crowbar at Terry's studio. So it completely sort of firmed up our friendship. And I went on and I did a number of albums with Terry at the studio where he was engineering. And we just kept in touch. We, you know, our families hung out together, our children, our wives, everything, and just developed a strong relationship. So pretty much everything Terry did, he would talk to me about, and particularly if it wasn't something, if you want, that he's doing for another label. But even if it was, he'd play me some of it, talk to me about it. But particularly, he had all these side projects that he and Doug Riley, his partner, were doing at Toronto Sound. One of them was Dr. Music, which I helped him with early on. I got a couple of songs for them that were key songs for them to record, which they did and became hits. So, so Terry would play me any of the stuff. So one day he calls me and says, Frank, I've got something really unusual, really special. I want you to hear. See what you think of it. So he comes over to my office and he puts on some of the Klaatu, at that point unmixed or not completed, but some of that first album.
Was that a cassette? Was that a cassette then?
Probably, almost certainly. I don't think he even bought a reel-to-reel to play it on a reel-to-reel. It was probably a cassette. So the very first song he played me, which I will never forget, was Dr. Marvelo from that first Klaatu album. Basically, before the end of it, I said, Terry, I've got to sign them. I want to sign the band. It was instant. It was so different, so unusual, so well done. And I loved the song. I loved everything about it. The lyric, just everything was so good. The production was superb. So I said, I've got to sign them. And he said, well, look, he played me a couple of other things. And he said, let me go back, talk with the guys. And he told me obviously a bit about what had happened, that over a period of time, they had been developing these tracks on the downtime at the studio. So whenever there was downtime, in came John, Terry, and Dee, and worked with Terry the other Terry Brown, on the record. So basically, Klaatu then was 4 guys. It was the 3, essential guys, plus the other essential, which was Terry Brown, the producer engineer. And it was a labor of love for them. And of course, very shortly after I met with the band, obviously had the strangest situation develop, because they were all for signing with me and all of that. And obviously Terry Brown had told them a lot about me. But they said, here's the thing, Frank, we don't want to publicize or promote who we are, because we're nobodies. And we are not Eric Clapton's second cousin removed. We're not, because the whole industry was all about hype at that point. How much hype can you put behind this project to get people to pay attention, to listen to it, and then add it and play it? And it was all done very innocently and very legitimately. We don't want any hype around us, because we are nobodies. Nobody knows who the heck we are. And if you're cool with that, and if you'll go along with that, then let's do a deal. So I said, of course. And I just had to have the record, basically. And that's how we got involved, and that's how it started. And of course, that's how it went through right until the period when this whole thing exploded, with the album. And of course, everybody's saying, well, who are these guys? Well, there's no names on the album. There's no credits. There's no... And the real hurdle before that was getting them signed to Capitol in the US. And that, again, was a good friend, another Brit, who was head of A&R for Capitol at the time, Rupert Perry. And they loved it. I brought it to them. They heard some of the early tracks before they were fully mixed, and they loved it. And of course, their natural inclination was to say, as they would for any act that came through the front door, we want to see them. Let's go see them live. Let's meet them. Let's see what they're all about. I was the quasi-manager at that point, as well as the original record label. And let's see what we think. And I said to Rupert, one of my conditions in signing this band is that they not be, their names not be used, and they want to remain incognito, and they don't want a hype machine behind this record. And so we talked about it, and I said they're intransigent on this. I can't do the deal unless those are the conditions. And he said, well, Frank, they've got to be on the record agreement signing it. And I said, no, they can't be, and they don't have to be, because we're doing this through a production company. We will deliver the band and this record and any options through a production company. And that would be Terry's production company and my record label. So since we're guaranteeing all of the things you require in the agreement, that's got to be the way it goes down. And kudos for Rupert. He went along with it, accepted it. And the lawyers, of course, at Capitol were saying, well, this is no good. I mean, this doesn't give us the direct relationship with these guys should something weird happen here. What if the production company goes bankrupt? What if all of that, but we still got it done.
At what point did you guys look at each other and think, because didn't someone come up to you and say, well, who are these guys? And then someone say publishing, why? Someone looked up the publishing and found their names. And
they did. It was a guy called Dwight. Forgotten his last name, but he was at WWDC in Washington.
Yes.
And he simply walked across to the Library of Congress, went into the copyright division, said, I want to see the registration certificates for calling occupants of interplanetary craft and Sub Rosa Subway. And because the band had not tried to hide anything other than not wanting to use their names. They had registered the songs the correct way through the publishing with the Library of Congress. And that's when it obviously broke, was Dwight saying, well, I know who these guys are. They're nobodies. they're from Toronto, and here are their names. It's not the Beatles. And, we had, up to that point, really hedged on the questions, because the questions were really difficult and direct. Are the Beatles involved in this? Are these the Beatles? Blah, blah, blah. It went on and on and on. So what my role as their quasi-manager was to say, I kept repeating the same line. The band wants to remain anonymous. They want to let the music speak for itself. And of course, it was a perfect storm, because that just added to the intrigue and the feeling of, this guy's hiding something. And then, hold on, he worked for EMI Records, the Beatles label. Hold on, Terry Brown's an English engineer who engineered all these big bands, The Who and the Kinks and you name it. And they were all just putting 2 and 2 together, but it wasn't 2 and 2. It was a very odd number, which they never managed to add up to. And it was strange, because as I look back on it, shortly after, if you like, the bubble burst, it was with sadness, because they were a great band. Plateau were a great band. And they had developed something which, the only thing, and you're right, it really wasn't the Beatles. There was Beatles overtones to some things. What drove it mostly was the production was very George Martin-like, because Terry was using all sorts of sounds, backwards effects, tapes, loops, all sorts of stuff that were very sophisticated and produced an incredible sound. And if you like, that was George Martin. And you may know, of course, that Dee, the guitar player for Plateau, went eventually over to England and worked with George. And in fact, I had a relationship with George that was predated. All of that was back in England in the 60s, when he was one of the A&R guys at EMI when I was working there. And George would frequently send me up an acetate of a new record that had been produced by him or by any of the other A&R guys at EMI at the time. All incidentally, who were not credited back then. It was an EMI production. It was not produced by George Martin or produced by John Burgess or Ron, the guy who did all the Hollies records. It was all an EMI production. And then, of course, that changed as soon as the pop music world exploded from England. Suddenly producers were realizing their importance, and they started getting the credits for their productions. Ron Richards was the Hollies producer. I worked with all of those guys at EMI. So I had that relationship, which was another thing that helped fuel the fire for Plateau, was, well, this guy knows these people and there must be a connection. And indeed, I signed an act of George Martin's to my label a few years, it would have been before Plateau. So I already had a new relationship post-EMI with George through my own label, a band called the Huggett Family. They were from Ottawa, and they were a classical Renaissance group that, of course, would have been exactly what George loved, because that was his upbringing. He was classically trained. He had produced so many classical records, and as well as comedy records and all these other things. And so the Huggett Family, he did 2 albums with them, which I released over here. And we already had that relationship reestablished. So, very weird. And then, of course, the irony of Dee going over to work with George later. There you go.
Everyone wants that to be the Beatles. They want that. I mean, wouldn't it be great that the Beatles kind of like came at the center of the pie from a different angle, but they couldn't escape sounding like the Beatles because they're the Beatles.
Yeah.
But by the way, one of the guys, I'm not sure one of the guys, it's not Terry Brown, but one of the original three guys that called you, because the interview's 2 years old. I'm about to revisit it now, thanks to you, but had called you the Beatles of industry people. It might have been John, because John wouldn't go on camera because it's John and he does his own thing. Yeah. But I remember going, that's like one of the nicest compliments I've ever heard someone say to someone. The Beatles of the industry. There you go, sir.
Well, that's really nice. I never heard that. And what can I say? That's a lovely, lovely thing. And John is such an interesting character anyway. And it was funny, we hit it off immediately because John liked those slightly left of center, but great pop records from earlier on, from the early 60s, even the late 50s. Like the Green Pipers, Lemon Tambourine, the Green Tambourine.
Green Tambourine, yeah.
Remember that? Lemon Pipers, and Walk Away Renee by Left Bank. And very shortly after we first met, John and I had really connected musically on those records, how much we loved them. All sorts of obscure ones, and obviously ones that were very big hits, but that were not what you call mainstream pop. They were very artistic, left of mainstream. And we established a very good, close relationship for all those years, as I did with the others. But then, of course, Dee left for Vancouver, and he's now a bit distant in terms of, because of the location and distance. Not a guy I can see easily or even talk to every day. But Dee was a super talent, and so much part of the talent that drove that band came from Dee too. And, they all played their roles. Three of them were amazing together. And that's really John's feeling about the whole thing, is they can never duplicate individually. Because I often said to him, well, don't you want to keep writing and making records and maybe doing it under your own name? Or no, he didn't. He had another life anyway, as you probably know, as an accountant, and that paid the bills. So he said, no, Klaatu was something special, the three of us, and it can't be duplicated, and I don't want to do it on my own.
Calling Occupants. If you play that song for anybody who's got at least some kind of curious mind about music, that's like a changing the direction of your musical taste kind of song.
It is. It really is. And, that's why that comment I made to you about, I felt really sad because it was interesting. Before that rumor broke, Klaatu had some devoted fans in the US and Canada already. There was a station, Kylo, in Seattle, that was crazy about the band before any of these rumors broke. They just loved the record. And there were a number of stations. Actually, Kylo made it their #1 album of that year above anything else. And it was by this unknown band, and they were happy with that. They didn't conjecture it was the Beatles. They just thought it was a brilliant record. And there were a number of stations like that. So I often wonder to myself, what would Klaatu have been without that rumor having occurred? And I think about those stations and those people who loved it for the music and for how unusual it was and how different. And like a lot of those bands in that period where record labels would sign them, but they wouldn't drop them after one album if they hadn't sold 1 million records. If they'd sold, which we had by that point, maybe 20, 25,000 in the US, which was small but meaningful. You know, when 25,000 people buy your record and you're a record label, you don't drop the band. There's something there.
Yeah.
And you get these rave reviews at the end of the year and #1 album of the year from these FM stations. You don't drop the band, you keep going with them. So I've often thought to myself, you know, if they'd kept going with this band called Klaatu, no Beatles affiliations, rumors, etc., what would they have become? And the answer in my mind is they would never have made Endangered Species or Magenta Lane. They would have gone on and made these ultra progressive records like a lot of their contemporary bands at the time. They would have been their own King Crimson, their own Electric Light Orchestra, and all of those things, and would have forged their own sound going forward that would have been incredible. Because when we did the Hope album, I mean, Hope to me is a greater album than the first one because it's cohesive. It has a concept. And I remember going down to play Hope for the Capitol, the whole Capitol team, because by now I didn't just have to sit and play it to the head of A&R, that was Rupert. Everybody wanted to hear it. So the whole management team at Capitol, not only that, but the worldwide chairman who flew in, Bhaskar Menon from India, he was the chairman of EMI at the time, obviously headquartered in London, but he was from India. They all flew in to hear the second Klaatu album in Los Angeles, and I played it for them, and the marketing guy was weeping at the end of Hope. He was weeping, and they were going, this is going to be huge. Now, this was before the rumor broke, because we'd already got on and finished the second album. Yeah. So it was not about the rumor so much as it, well, no, I should backtrack. The rumor had broken. They had sold a lot of records, which is obviously, but Capitol was seeing this as a long-term project. They weren't seeing this as, oh, well, let's make hay while the sun shines with this rumor. Hence, they all got together to listen to the record, loved it, thought it was going to go through the roof. They'd already sold a lot of the first album. They said, this one is going to be a monster. It's like a Pink Floyd album. It's that sort of concept that is going to sell millions. And obviously, it was a big disappointment to us with all the time we'd spent that, and I'm sort of recollecting the history now, because the band were told to hold up that album and not release it because they were still selling so many copies of the first album. And it was at that point that artists being artists did what they did. They decided to strip out all of the London Philharmonic Orchestra that we had put on Klaatu in London, put on that Hope album. They decided to strip all that out and replace it all with synthesizers, which were obviously the cool instrument at the time, with synths, not this beautiful, massive orchestra. So that's why there was a big holdup before that release. And then by then the band had remixed the whole album, replaced all of the strings with synths, and that was the record that came out. And then, of course, which to me was a disappointment, because the one with the orchestra was far grander and bigger. And of course, eventually we did release that on one of the late re-releases of Hope, and on the Sunset album, which was a box set collection, we put the original orchestra back in, and it was magnificent.
Sun Goes By, Dr. Music, Doug Riley. I played that, and I remember people were going, everyone was saying, I haven't heard that in ages. Unless you were in a classic rock kind of station, no one played that song anymore. To me, that's one of the quintessential songs in Canadian music history. That song gives me goosebumps to this day. What can you tell me?
Great song. All I can tell you about that is I was in and out of the studios they were doing it, A great song. But what I can tell you about is the follow-up, because I got that song for them with a good friend of mine, the
Neil Sedaka?
Neil Sedaka song, One More Mountain to Climb. And that also became a big hit for them. And Richie and I were instrumental in getting that song to Terry and Doug because they needed a really good follow-up to Sun Goes By. And that's what it was. And yeah, and Neil Sedaka was not happy about that. And what happened was Richie, being a journalist that would get acetates and pre-release records from all sorts of labels to write either reviews on them, or in this case with Neil, liner notes. He was asked to write the liner notes for Neil's album. So I hung out a lot with Richie in those days, and he played it to me. He played me Neil's album. And I went, God, that song, One More Mountain, it's a fantastic song. And then we got talking about it, and I played it to Terry, and they said, and Doug, and they said, well, this is perfect. And we should not really have done that, because the album hadn't come out. Neil's album hadn't come out. And we took a bit of a flyer with it. I mean, hopefully, because I never spoke to him, Neil, about it ever. And I don't know, Richie heard from the label and said that they'd heard that some other act from Canada had recorded Neil's song. How was that possible? So I guess Richie fudged probably and got away with it, but they weren't happy about it, because obviously, you know, when an artist like Neil Sedaka puts out a record, you don't want his songs having already been heard and recorded by others. But it did make some good money, so hopefully he was, in hindsight, happy with that. But yeah, that's the story of Dr. Music and One More Mountain.
Doug Riley, how well did you know Doug? Very
well, because Doug, basically early on, when Terry and I were working, and Terry particularly was doing the Tattoo album, no, I knew him before then, Doug, because whenever we needed string parts or a special arrangement on something, Terry would always say to me, well, Doug will do it. Let Doug hear it. So that's what we did. And Doug early on did a band. I had signed a band called Christmas. And we decided to put strings on a single of the release of the band Christmas. And Doug did those parts. He arranged the strings, did it all. He also arranged the strings with me on a Foot and Coldwater's Make Me Do Anything You Want. Those pizzicato strings, that's Doug's arrangement, and all of the string and horn parts on Make Me Do Anything You Want. The same with the song that they did called Love Is Coming, from the second album, I think that was, had horns on it that Doug arranged. So yeah, I mean, I used Doug a lot to arrange all sorts of things on our records. He played on the first King Biscuit Boy and Crowbar album too. I think he played some B3 parts on Official Music. Rick Bell obviously was the pianist then, so I mean, Rick was incredible. The same as Doug was incredible. And in fact, my relationship with Doug went as long as the very last record that I'm aware of that Doug played on before he died was Serena Ryder's album, If Your Memory Serves You Well, which I was executive producer on. And I brought in Doug from Prince Edward Island to play on Serena's album. And he did several tracks, including an incredible version of a Shelton Brooks song. The title has gone from me at this second, but anyway, it's on Serena's album, and Doug's playing on that is simply brilliant. And I remember the producer, Steve McKinnon, another good friend of mine, having to, while Doug was playing the B3 parts on one of these songs, the the horn on the B3 that keeps spinning, that makes it sound, kept sticking. So as Doug's playing, Steve McKinnon is under the keyboard releasing the spinning thing to ensure that the B3 sound was still there. And that was Doug's last recording project, and I brought him in from Prince Edward Island to do that. And not long after, maybe a month or so after, he was on that flight in Calgary and had a heart attack. And lovely guy, one of the greatest musicians I ever met or worked with. And you go back and listen to all the work he did on so many sessions for so many great artists, and including Ray Charles, obviously, and including Night Moves. He played keyboards on Seeger's Night Moves, and just brilliant player.
Serena Ryder's third album came out. I remember going, this is her debut album. It was her third, but I remember thinking, what? Most of these are covers with the exception of a few near the end. And I'm going, this is like the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I love it when you hear, and you've done this a million times, where you hear someone, you go, who is this?
Yeah, that's basically what it was with her. I was at a Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame press conference, and it was to introduce our new inductees for that year. And Serena was going to do a couple of the really old songs we were inducting, going way back. I think they were songs from the 40s. And I'd never heard her sing. I knew nothing about her. And I heard this voice, and she was incredible. And I was so struck. I knew her manager well. I went up to her, the manager, Sandy, and to Serena afterwards. And I said, that was incredible. You should make a record, and we should do a record of all of these classic songs. And she said, I'm in. It was, very impromptu and on the spur of the moment. And I said, well, that's great. And within 24, 48 hours, I had a proposal to them. And then I got Steve in to come and see her with me, Steve McKinnon. And he came in, and we saw she was doing a tiny little showcase at, it was either the Drake Hotel or the Gladstone, one of the two in Toronto here. And Steve was just blown away, like he should be and would be and was. And and then we did the record.
It's a cliche to say this, but when I first heard her, I'm going, yep, she's 1,000 years old. I don't know where she's been, man, but she's firmly in that. And to be able to interpret songs that were done a long time before she was around, or when she was very young.
Yeah, superb voice, incredible, natural. You can't, those artists are not built over time. It's born into them. Her uncle was actually, I don't know whether you know about that, but he was, his name was, I think it was Bob Carpenter. He made a couple of records going way back, early 70s, that were brilliant. They came out, they were lost, never to be heard or seen again. And then over time became real cult items. And that's Serena's uncle. But anyway, she just is. She's a natural. You can't groom those things or make an artist into those things. They either have it or they don't, and she's got it in spades.
But I've always been intrigued by King Biscuit Boy. So much incredible talent in one guy. And
amazing, absolutely amazing. Lovely guy with obviously a big problem. And, he managed to get through those early years with the problem and deal with it and, work around it. Just a beautiful, beautiful person. And he was so badly bent. And that's one of the tracks off that album. He was so badly bent by alcohol, and it cost him his marriage, his relationship with his son. It cost him so much. I kept going with him because, when he got in the studio and was, wasn't intoxicated, he was brilliant. And he was the leader of that band. I mean, even though Crowbar then, of course, split with him, or he split with them, actually, and they went off on their own with me, too. But he was the leader. He was strong in that sense. Knew what everybody should be doing, told them what they should be doing. Obviously, Kelly J was the fun part of it all. But the two of them were a deadly combination. And then Richard obviously went on and we did the follow-up album together, Good 'Uns. Again, he was so in control of that record, knew exactly what he wanted. And was just a person who attracted brilliant musicians around him because of his talent. And we just, and then of course, I went on with Crowbar, and we did an entirely different record. I mean, picking up on a lot of what Biscuit had started, but much more in the boogie woogie, fun, party type record. And whereas Richard really would have loved to have gone even more traditional blues than we did. But I was always pulling him a little bit into the commercial center so that he would make records that would be heard, not just loved.
Kelly J, Oh, What a Feeling. I remember first time I saw, there's a few live videos. I think there's at least one big one. I remember looking at him and going, holy snapping turtles, like holy, like the embodiment of many people in one person, big guy. I tried to get him here in Calgary. I had heard from, I think it was his son who told me he was going through some stuff. He had hoarding problems. I saw that clip online. Everyone's got stuff, whatever it is. But I'm from the school of it's not how you fall down, it's how you get up. Sometimes you can't. But tell me about Oh, What a Feeling.
Well, Oh, What a Feeling, I mean, basically is just Kelly's mantra being exposed to a group of great musicians who are absolutely at their peak then. And as Kelly would say, hey, it's a one-chord song. This isn't rocket science, but it's got so much fun and energy in it, it didn't matter. And, he was truly larger than life as a person. Again, another guy I loved. He was just so artistic and wanted to do everything. He just was a guy, and I've met a few of them over the years who you just can't bridle them in the sense of they're just constantly on to something else. You can never keep him in one place. He wanted to launch magazines. He wanted to launch with one of his wives, hat companies, developing, hat. Then he wanted to be a filmmaker. And then he was a guy that didn't matter who he was with, they loved him, and he was a charmer, and he impressed them. And that's why he had, relationships with Trudeau and Maggie. But Kelly was great. Wherever he was in the studio next door to John Lennon when John was doing a record, and suddenly Kelly is John's best friend. I mean, it doesn't matter where he is, people loved him. Obviously he was so big and he was so colorful, and he was all about Canada, which was what made him, in a way, so ahead of his time. Canada wasn't in the music business in 1970, wasn't cool, right? Canada wasn't cool. It was uncool. And we couldn't get arrested down in the States and throughout the rest of the world. But Kelly embraced being Canadian and made it cool. And so by the time Crowbar was really at their peak, young Canadian kids were happy to be cool. And they would hear, songs like Tits Up on the Pavement in Wawa, Ontario, and Deadhead Out of St. John's, and, you know, all of these songs about their country and Canada. And hey, Crowbar's cool. That song is obviously cool. And, you know, that was really Kelly. He was so Canadian and, you know, got that moniker of Captain Canada and always wore everything that had maple leafs emblazoned all over it, his boots, his everything. And basically, the Bad Manners album, the first Crowbar album, was, as I think I've got somewhere in the liner notes, it was a party. I mean, basically, it was just a party from beginning to end. For me, it was eye-opening. I was a bit of a conservative Brit, you know, over here, and watching these wild, you know, players and playing in these dingy clubs originally, before they got onto the concert stage and became, you know, the act they became. Just smoky R&B bars, but it was eye-opening for me, and particularly coming from a country where blues was loved, and American blues and black blues was really embraced and loved, and here was this all-white band that, you know, was just authentic and, you know, playing, young guys playing all of this stuff. Now, Kelly, of course, was older than most of the rest of the band and came from an earlier period. He loved he loved the music from the 50s, that sort of cool music from the 50s. So he embraced all of these past musical influences, as well as obviously what Crowbar was as a rock and boogie band.
You're there. Like the kid inside you is still there. And I mean this is the most sincere compliment to you that you're so present. You're still here, like 100%. Tell me why.
Thank you. And I think the only reason, having looked at all of the musicians who I've loved and worked with for all these years, and watched some of the problems that have evolved in their lives, and we just spoke about Richard, the King Biscuit Boy, and others, many others. I've never been a big drinker. In fact, drink very little. Enjoy it when I do, always with a meal, let's say a glass of red wine, the occasional beer, but very modestly. I never, other than Kelly J, I went on a tour with Kelly J, who I call the greatest promotion man in history. I went on a radio tour with him from coast to coast just after the Bad Manners album had come out. And we literally went everywhere. We just hopped on planes from city to city to city across the country. And Kelly managed to get me to experiment a little. Nothing too serious, like some hashish and, you know, stuff like that, as we were going from place to place. And I enjoyed it, but it never was something that after that I wanted to continue doing. And in some ways, as a person who's very much on the creative side of the business, that was a limitation, because obviously to some extent, inhibitions are dropped when you either are drinking a lot or you're doing a lot of other stuff. Your inhibitions are dropped and your mind is certainly expanded into doing and envisioning things that you might not do when you're straight.
Isn't there an aspect in the software of who you are that said you have to be the adult in your role?
I do, and I did. And basically, when I came over from England, I was 23 years old. I got into a partnership with Ronnie Hawkins, of all people, and launched a record label, got major distribution, the first independent Canadian label that ever had major distribution in Canada. Bernie Finkelstein followed just a few months later with Bruce and Columbia. But I was the first, and yeah, I I had to be on top of my game because I was producing records at night, managing the artists, publishing them, had a record label that required its own set of responsibilities. There's no way I could have done that if I'd been imbibing or over imbibing. So yeah, I have to look to that as a big reason why. And, I guess I'll come back again to my public school upbringing. In England, those are private schools, public schools. And then going on to Naval Academy, there's a big sense of self-discipline that rules in that environment. And you just become very used to being disciplined about your life and the time you are spending on things. And I think between those two is probably why I still have a pretty good idea of everything that happened. And of course, I have recounted these stories a number of times, so that helps ingrain it. And I even realized as I was talking to you about Tattoo is that what I first did with the Hope album was actually play that group, the orchestral album. And that's what they were weeping over and loved. And then when they said, no, we can't release it right away, we've got to delay the release because the record sales are going through the roof on the first album, we just cut them off. We put out another album now. We've got to delay that. It was when it got delayed that, of course, then the band went back and started stripping out the orchestra and putting on the synths. So if I got that backwards, there's a little slip in the memory.
Symphonic version ever been released?
It has. It was released on the box set that we called Sunset. And it was basically the best of the band, but a big collection. Like it was almost every track they'd recorded. I wrote extensive liner notes for it, almost like a little mini book. But that is, yes, that's the Orchestral Symphonic London Philharmonia on that, which Doug, here's a Doug story for you. For weeks before our London trip, I'd been saying to Terry, Terry, we need the parts for the London Philharmonia that are booked. Has Doug got to them yet? And so Terry would keep saying to me, Frank, he's too busy, but he'll do it. If Doug says he'll do it, he will do it. And I said, but we're getting down to the fine wire now. We're leaving in 2 weeks. Fast forward 2 days before. Terry, has Doug done the parts now? Are they all ready? Because obviously they've got to be written out. These are going to have to be presented to an orchestra in written out form. So Terry says, Frank, I hate to say it, but no, he hasn't started on them. I don't know what's going to happen, but he will have them. Doug will have them. Doug did them on the flight over. On the overnighter that was booked the day before the sessions, Doug wrote out all the parts, had them ready for the lead sheet writer when he arrived. They then spent all the time doing all of the different parts for the different parts of the orchestra, writing them out. But Doug wrote all the arrangements on the plane flying over for a Philharmonic orchestra that was going to be recording the band's symphonic work, Hope.
Foot in Cold Water, that
Yes.
band. I remember when that band disappeared. I remember, love the vocalist. I remember thinking, there was just something, make you do anything you want. That song is like the epitome of what I wanted in the 70s. in the early 70s. That song moved me. It's one of those my songs for me.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about the band and the song?
So what I'll tell you about it is going back, it was because, again, back to radio, it was because of a show on Chum FM that I became aware of the band. And it was Larry Green's show on Chum FM. Larry had a late night show on Chum FM. Usually he would play some unusual, unsigned artists on it. So this night, I happened to be listening. Larry was playing a band who had been Nucleus. Nucleus was a band, a Canadian band signed to Bob Shadd's Mainstream Records in New York. And their album, which was very progressive, very experimental, had been signed by Bob Shadd, no Canadian label, because I'm talking now the late 60s. So there was no Canadian label around that really was there to sign them. And but they got heard by a guy in New York, and he signed them. Phil Ramone, the great Phil Ramone, produced their album for Bob Shadd. So anyway, long and short of it, Larry is playing a bit of Nucleus on his Chum FM late night show, and then he plays a couple of demos of Nucleus had broken up, but some of the key members of Nucleus had joined up with a couple of other guys, including the singer Alex Machin, and he played a couple of their demos. Well, I was knocked out. I loved it. I immediately got hold of Larry and said, "Who is this? Who's behind it? I want to connect with them." So anyway, long story short, a Chum AM DJ called Johnny Mitchell was a co-financier with another manager, industry guy of this new band, who they had interim called, I think it might have been Leather or something like this. I can't remember their interim name, but anyway, I met with them, met with the guys, Johnny Mitchell and his partner, who had invested in this new forming of the core of Nucleus with a couple of new guys, who was Alex Machin and Paul Nauman, the guitar player. So I arranged to go and hear them in the basement of one of the members of the band's house in Scarborough. They played me 2 or 3 songs, very heavy, fantastic, incredible musicians. And then they played me Make Me Do Anything You Want. And I went, guys, this is a monster. This is a hit. And, you know, these are guys who had been around a long time. Yeah. Huey and Danny go back to the Lords of London. They had a big hit called Cornflakes and Ice Cream as the Lords of London. And they then became part of Nucleus and, you know, an incredible background also with the keyboard player called Bob Horn. So anyway, they moved on to this new band with Alex and Paul, who I heard in the basement. And I went, well, you know, I want to sign you guys. That's an incredible song. The rest of the material was brilliant because it was just so hard-edged. And they were an incredible bunch of musicians. Just, you know, I actually had never heard anything as good, ever. Because you've got to remember with other bands, well, Crowbar were a particular type of band. They were tight as can be. They had, as you know, worked with Ronnie Hawkins for a long time. They had got their chops together. They were great, good musicians. But Foot and Coldwater were playing something completely original to me. Obviously, they had inspirations. You could hear a bit of Deep Purple. You could hear a bit of this and that. But what we did then in that production was we took them out of that area with songs like Make Me Do Anything You Want. Now, Alex, the singer, that's not the route he really wanted to go. He liked the really hard rock sound of the rest of the album. And I liked the combination of their power, but with great melodies. I added the orchestra because of, again, coming back to Trident, because of Gus Dudgeon's productions, early productions, where he would add Paul Buckmaster.
Oh, Buckmaster, yeah.
Incredible.
The
beautiful,
king.
Absolutely. Beautiful string arrangement. So that's what inspired me to put strings on Make Me Do Anything You Want. And it's what helped develop their sound into something unique. It was still something that Alex, he was thrilled that it was a big hit. I speak with him constantly, as I do the other members of the band, other than Paul Nauman, who died. But it's what made their sound unique. Alex still wanted to rock. He wanted to be Zeppelin. He wanted to be all of the sort of British rock bands. But the sound we developed with this acoustic but electric and combination of hard edge sound was unique, and it separated them from all of those other bands. And I think Alex has got to appreciate that in hindsight. But for instance, after Make Me Do, which obviously did become a big hit and a classic hit, and of course what it had, another stamp it had, was Paul Nauman. And Paul Nauman, again, one of the most original, unique guitar players ever. He had his problems, but it didn't stop him from being just a brilliant guitarist. And I can actually picture him in the studio now laying down his tracks. And he was just incredible. And bringing in a really great engineer like I had on that first foot, Lee DiCarlo from New York, was made all the difference, because Lee really knew guitar sounds. So he and Paul musically and sonically were just joined at the hip. He totally got everything Paul was wanting to do sound-wise, and it just made that production and that sound live. And so much so that when we came to the second album, I wanted Paul to show a lot more of his chops on the second album. And if you remember it, it intros with a long piece called Mo's Into E, which is basically Paul Nauman showing his classical guitar chops as well as his electric chops and his Strat. What we did with the second album was, there was a song that, to me, and obviously this is hard to say for everybody who knows Foot for Make Me Do Anything You Want, but it is an even greater song than that. In the same style, and that's why I added strings to it too, was Isn't Love Unkind in My Life? I thought that should have, where Make Me Do Anything You Want went solidly top 10, and in some markets top 3 or even number 1. Mm-hmm. Isn't Love Unkind in My Life, to me, should have been a worldwide hit. And I spent more time mixing that song than most albums I've ever produced. The whole album. Yeah, just mixing it. It was so hard to mix. There were so many parts. Another incredible Paul Nauman guitar in it. And it was the song that I made the Island Records deal in England with. Like, obviously it also, I think, influenced the Elektra Asylum deal a great deal too, but that was a little later, because I made the single deal only for Isn't Love Unkind in My Life with Island, with Chris Blackwell and David Betteridge there at Island. And that was when Robert Wace and Ray Williams came in to manage the band for me. for a brief period. Island never picked up on an album, which was a shame. I don't know how much exposure they managed to get to in my life, but I'm sure it was both Make Me Do Anything You Want and In My Life that influenced Elektra to sign them. And so when it came to the second album, they wanted to redo both those songs, Elektra. And John Anthony did. He recut Make Me Do Anything You Want, and he recut I'll tell you about Isn't Love Unkind in My Life, but he started to recut Isn't Love Unkind in My Life. He came to the conclusion they couldn't better the original. So what he did was he went back to all of my tapes and remixed it, and it sounds great on the record and all of that. But what happened with Make Me Do Anything You Want was he did do a completely new version of it. Didn't take any of my tapes or anything, just redid the whole thing. It was great because it became a hit again. I was thrilled. I was the publisher of it too, so I was happy on that score. John, I was, reverential of John and his production, so there was nothing that I wasn't, what's the word? I wasn't a producer who was going, well, what the hell is this guy doing with the song that I already produced that was already a hit? I was fine with it, but at the end of the day, it's not as good as the original. I think John might admit that if he went back and A-B'd them. I'd love to have that conversation with him, but it isn't because they cut down the guitar solo, which should have been the expanded one. And this was all basically for radio to make it shorter. My version was 5 minutes and 5 seconds. His version was maybe 3:15, 3:30. So they cut out the big guitar solo. They cut out the ending, which was a long ending with Paul unwinding at the end, just magnificently. And so as far as I know, Canadian radio, even though they made John's version a hit again, they always go back to playing my version. The stations that can play a 5-minute song still play that version and not the new one. With Isn't Love Unkind in My Life, John just turned to me and said, I can't improve that. It's an incredible production. I'm going to remix it, but I can't improve it. So great, I'm happy with that. And it then spawned a route I took with the second album, which was to have more of that type of material. I still had the heavy side of Foot, which was a big part of them, and live, you could never take that away. They were a very heavy band live. But I introduced songs that Huey Leggett, the bass player, was writing. Huey is another super talent, and he wrote Love Is Coming, which he actually sung on the record. And then he did another song that Alex sung, sort of reluctantly, but did. And I think he was happy he did in the end. But it was all going down this much more sophisticated route with great band tracks, but added to them parts that were unusual for a band as heavy as them. For instance, we had string bass on Love Is Coming. And I think, if my memory serves me well, Paul Nauman played the string bass on Love Is Coming. And then I had Doug Riley orchestrate a whole part for that, which included French horns. And again, my influences there were both the Paul Buckmaster, but also Procol Harum, with all of Procol's incredible orchestral tracks from obviously Salty Dog, but also Grand Hotel and all of those. So I was very influenced by that. and in fact had a track on the second album called Sailing Ships, which Alex sung, but he sings from a distance, like he's way off across the sea. It was a little too subtle. I should have mixed him up in hindsight, because people didn't get that his vocal was supposed to be way back, as if it's across the ocean. But anyway, it was called Sailing Ships, and it was another beautiful acoustic electric song, again with another Naumann guitar solo that was unbeatable. And so that built that side of the band. And then Elektra signed them, and obviously the worst part of all of that was I signed them with Jack Holtzman, who was very wide-thinking, understanding musically man who could accept this combination of very hard rock band with this acoustic side. He then was promoted to the senior vice president of Warner Communications and left Elektra Asylum, or I should say Elektra. I'm sort of preceding when I say Elektra Asylum. I signed the band to Elektra, Jack Holtzman's label. But then they brought in David Geffen and his Asylum Records, and it became Elektra Asylum. And he dropped a whole slew of artists, probably never listened to their records, maybe didn't get them or whatever. And Foot and Coldwater was one of those. And it was, again, one of those political things. A new president comes in, a new head. No, I don't need those bands. I didn't sign them. Let them go. And Foot was one of them. And it didn't end their career, but then Ray Daniels, Rush's manager, picked them up. I started doing some new tracks we put out as singles, and then Ray picked them up and signed them directly to Anthem Records, and they did that last album, Breaking Through, which I published. I published all of it. It was a good record, really good record. They were a handful. I think they were too much of a handful for Ray. He was used to the Rush guys, who were just such lovely guys, gentlemen. And there was obviously a trust already inbuilt for years between Ray and the three guys in Rush. But with Foot, it was a new relationship for him. He obviously respected them, which is why he signed them to the label. But they were a handful, and he wasn't maybe used to that. And so they did the fourth album, and that was it.
To me, as a music fan, I love that. Speaking of Foot and Coldwater, I love the fact that Flood, which I know is in your hemisphere. Flood, to me, their last hit was really What an Animal was their biggest hit. And by the way, were you working with them then?
I started that album, but then I got into financial difficulty with the label.
With Daffodil.
And Al Mayer had decided to start a new label, an independent label, Attic Records.
Yeah.
With Tom Williams, who had been at Warner's when Flood were at Warner's. And so they wanted to try and get Flood. They knew I was having some financial problems. I had started an album with Flood, with Lee DiCarlo producing them at the Manor in England.
Was that Great Expectations?
It was.
Yeah.
And it was Richard Branson's studio, of course. And Flood was the second act in there after Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. And so it was all new for Richard Branson and having this studio in the Cotswolds and everything. So I sent Lee over with the band, and basically, as I learned later, the band partied most of the time they were there. They laid down a few tracks, didn't finish anything, brought it all back.
Wasn't Brian at that time near that album? He was already sick, right?
Yeah, not many of us knew about that at that point. I didn't know how sick he was, but he was obviously such a guiding force in that band. And obviously that's why what happened to them happened. But then, so Al Mayer approached me and knew that I had was having some financial difficulties, heard about the record I'd done in England and that it wasn't finished and that it was going to take quite a lot of money to finish it. So he said, "Can I buy it from you?" And I said, yes. So yes, that album that became Great Expectations started as my album. They bought several of the tracks, finished them, added to them, and it became Attic's first release, Flood. It seemed to be hard for people to reconcile a band that would sound one way live, but would record other things. And actually, you only have to look at Procol Harum to understand that, because Procol Harum were an R&B band originally. They were nothing like the grand. They were a good band, but they were an R&B band called the Paramounts. And they have morphed into this Procol Harum thing with obviously the whiter shade of pale, beautiful classical overtones, and then suddenly developed beyond that. But when you went to see them live, half of their show was really more rock and roll because of Robin Trower and their past sound. And then they would get to the grand stuff like Salty Dog and all of those sort of things. So it wasn't unknown, but it's a pity when people don't accept a band that has all those colors, because at the end of the day, it's still the band. Nothing changes. It's the same musicians, but they're just playing something slightly different as a break amongst all of the other stuff. And I love the hard side of Foot and Coldwater. And that's why we kept recording it, and it was recorded until the end. But it was all those other things on Ray Daniels' Anthem album too. There were several songs that fell into that grand, beautiful orchestral category, because and that had Naumann's signature guitar sound behind them, which was that beautiful, sweet, melodic playing that he just dreamed up these melodies, and they were almost always spontaneous. He never worked at those things a long time. They just came out. And I love April Wine. In fact, I wrote a foreword 4 miles for the book that he released not long before his death.
I don't know if you were part of What an Animal, but when you were mentioning doing that to make you do anything you want, there's that. First of all, he's got this amazing guitar thing going on at the end, and then there's like like an orchestration overlap thing, kind of sound like Phil Ramone with "I Love You Just the Way You Are" or 10cc "I'm Not in Love."
Oh, yeah.
That kind of thing. I love that. Were you part of that at all?
What an Animal, yes, because it did start with me, but it was not in. It was for my label, but I wasn't producing it. Leo was producing that in England. And the same with several other cuts. My Brother and Me, which I thought was going to be a big hit.
Well, it was a hit.
Yeah, it was. It did reasonably well. And,
Number 29.
No, it did it, huh? Right. I would have carried on probably with them and that record if Brother and Me had become a bigger hit, because it might have given me the impetus. But then knowing that the position I was in financially and having an offer from Almere as a brand new label starting up, wanting to sign this band, knowing that they had a relationship with Tom Williams, I did it. I wish I could have kept them. And it was indeed, there was a long break between me being able to start finishing records again for Daffodil because of that financial problem. I'd started, for instance, a second Christmas album, but we had renamed them The Spirit of Christmas. And I'd only got halfway through, and Lee DiCarlo again was the engineer for me on that. And I had to wait 18 months before I could finish that record when I got new money into the label and into the company and was able to do it. And that was another record. Very proud of that record too. And then of course, obviously back on Foot and Coldwater, out of Foot, even though they broke up, Huey Leggett and I just stayed together in one incarnation or another for years and years and years, because as a complete songwriter, he was the best of them all. And that's not to take away from Danny and Nauman, who obviously wrote Make Me Do Anything You Want. They wrote Isn't Love Unkind in My Life. But it was always, there was always something that was hard to get out of those two as songwriters. But Huey was a natural songwriter and wrote incredible songs. So we did a Private Eye album. I signed him to Capitol with his band Private Eye. And then I signed him, when they broke up, I signed him for the album that for me is the best production I ever did, and one of the best records I've ever been involved with, which was the Leggett album, which was Huey and his brother Gord, and an album called Illuminations, a double album that we did, which I think is a tour de force.
I'm always curious on lost treasures. What is that one? What's the one that got away that, people don't know that if they're not in the industry sometimes. Any industry is like that. You put so much into a project and all of a sudden, poof.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that project.
Yeah. So really after we'd done with Huey, I was a big believer in Huey. So we did the Private Eye album. We did have one decent sized hit off it, Your Place or Mine. I didn't produce that. I published it. It was on my label. So that was a reasonable sized hit. But it wasn't really where Huey wanted to go. He wanted to create more of, at that point, a sort of, dare I say it, a Allman Brothers, Lynyrd Skynyrd, sort of almost country rock album. So I convinced Capitol to let me go to Muscle Shoals. Would have been around, my production deal with Capitol in LA was 78. So it would have been around 79, 80, somewhere in that area. I think Private Eye came first. Then we went down to Muscle Shoals and Rick Hall was producing. Huey and Rick Hall did not get on at all. If you know anything about Rick, he's a real Southerner. He, spent half the time in the sessions spitting his backy into a spittoon across the room. Other musicians all over the record. Huey wanted it to be the core of him and his brother, and then adding other musicians in. Having said that, some great musicians played on it, and Huey loved that, like Roger Hawkins on drums. And he was over the moon about that. But the long and short of it is, we did most of an album there. It was shelved, never saw the light of day. So then, a year or so later, I went back to Capitol and I said, okay, I've been working with Huey on a whole new direction with him and his brother. Listen to some of the demos we put together. And by this time, even though my deal was with the United States, the US had given up on the Leggett brothers, or on Leggett, Huey. They'd given up. Hey, Frank, we've given you a lot of shots at the can here. We've given up on it. So I went to Dean Cameron here in Canada with it, and Dean loved it. And I said, Dean, there's a lot of material here for this record. I don't want it on a single album. It's got to be a double album. So I was asking Dean to sign Huey again through Capitol, but now to do a double album. And he said, go ahead. Here's the budget. If you can pull it off, go ahead. So we did, and we made the record. Steve Vaughan, another English guy who had moved to Canada, engineered it. I think it's a brilliant masterpiece. It has sounds on it that U2 were introducing 2, 3, 4 years later. A whole different type of sound. We were using something that was called a lexicon that had just been introduced, and we were experimenting with it. We did a lot of experimenting with this album. I brought Danny Taylor in from Foot and Coldwater to play the drums. I brought Gerald O'Brien in from the O'Brien Sexton to play keyboards. A bass player, terrible, I've forgotten his name, but he played great on it. But Huey's the bass player. So even though this guy did the basic tracks, Huey would then come in with a 6-string Fender bass and put on these incredible experimental bass parts on the record. And we had a minor hit from it called White Flags. And it was both an FM hit and a minor, I had to edit it down, a minor AM hit. But even with Michael Cole managing and Bill Ballard, the two of them co-managed Leggett, still couldn't get it out there. It was, I think, too experimental for and too progressive for a lot of the mainstream media, if you want. The one interesting side from it is that Blue Oyster Cult's manager heard the album, wanted to sign the band to their label, which we negotiated a deal, signed off on it. Never happened. It was one of those typical rock and roll things of that period. Even though you've got a signed deal, the deal never happened. But the one good thing that came out of that relationship, even though we were very upset about the deal not happening, was that Blue Oyster Cult cut White Flags, our key song from this record. And it was the last hit Blue Oyster Cult had, particularly in England. And so it was a sort of there was some poetic justice in it. But the real thing is that that album should have been a monster. It should have been a huge record. And it was certainly one of the ones, and the biggest one, because for me, because I produced it, I suppose, too, and had stuck with Huey all those years and believed in him, was I really wanted that record to happen badly. I tried the last 10 years to get the rights back to the album from Capitol, who had long since removed it from their catalog. It hadn't been available. And about 3 years ago, I started getting very forceful about it, saying, listen, you've had this in your catalog for 30 years. You're doing nothing with, actually it was more than 30 by this point. You're doing nothing with it. Let the band and the artist have it back. We'll offer you money to get it back. We'll pay an amount to get it back. They wouldn't listen to me. I had a long relationship with them. Wouldn't listen. Frank, sorry, it's our policy. We don't sell back old masters, no matter what level of success they had. Because I said to them, look, we hardly sold any records on this. It, came out in the US and disappeared. Came out in Canada, did a little. We sold a few records, but you're not losing a big profit item here. I'll probably pay you more than you ever earned from it to get the rights back. They wouldn't. They ended up by saying, Frank, as a compromise, we're going to put it up on Spotify. So it is available again, and people can hear it. So they did that. That was about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And
CanCon.
Yes.
You're the guy to talk to. Were you part of that? Trudeau was part of that, wasn't he? Wasn't it Trudeau's? How did that all start?
Okay, it started with a group of people that were the catalyst for it. And they included John Mills, who was then the head of CAPAC. They included Richie York, the Australian journalist who was living here then. They included Walt Grealis and Stan Cleese. And I'm trying to think who else was in that core group. So they that core group, and I know I'm missing one or two of them, spearheaded what they felt was the need for regulations that would change the landscape at radio primarily, but of course went out to television and film too, but would change the landscape for Canadian music to give it the opportunity to be heard. And by being heard, could build an industry. Because the problem back then was Canadian radio programmers, many of whom were Canadians, they were proud of their country, they loved their country, but what they were hearing was, if you want, inferior quality production. And I'm talking now late 60s, going into the 70s. So their argument was, I'm all for playing Canadian artists, but these records just don't stand up alongside the American and the English ones that we're playing, sonically, production-wise, and anything else. And of course, the reason they didn't is they were being made in little holes in the wall that were unsophisticated, producers who had never produced before, engineers who hadn't engineered. There was no infrastructure. There was no experienced people. It's one of the reasons, probably the primary reason I came to Canada, is I met Ronnie on a trip he was making around the world at the time, met him in London, and he said, look, I just lost my band to Bob Dylan. I've got another new band I've been grooming. I don't want to lose them. I want to create a record label, and your good friend Richie York says you're the guy I should get to run the record label and come to Canada. And that was the impetus for me coming. So back to CanCon. So this group then started meeting with a few others of us who were here in 1970 that were trying to do things with Canadian artists and record them, sign them. Terry obviously was one, Terry Brown, me, and there were others. And we joined with them to support them, their work and effort, which ended up basically in front of Pierre Juno first, the guy who subtly inspired the Juno Awards, even though Stan and Walt would often talk about the god of whatever Juno was, but they also recognized that Juno was the man who did it for us all. And it was, of course, during the Trudeau era, and Trudeau was a real liberal, but in the best sense of the word, not in Justin sense of the word. And he obviously had his head of the CRTC saying to him, we need to introduce regulations to require media to play things that are designated Canadian. And that's when Stan Cleese, of course, came up with the MAPL, Maple system, and it got into effect.
Was the Maple system 2 out of 4 back then? What was the criteria?
It was, yes, it was 2 out of 4. So it could be any one of those 4 in combination with another. Didn't have to be all of them. And then, so we as a group, and we formed the Canadian Independent Record Producers Association, which now is called CIMA, CIMA, but it was called SERPA. And we formed that, and by forming it, we became the supporters of this little catalyst group that had been fighting for Canadian content by saying, look at us. And it was myself, Terry Brown, Bob Ezrin, Jack Richardson, Alan McMillan, this whole group of record producers that were around then saying, we're going to produce these Canadian artists. We are already producing them. Give us the support that we need, A, to do something for them and for us, but also to build an industry. so that studios can open up, engineers can get experience, producers can get experience, managers can get experience. So that's what Pierre Junot saw in all of this. It's not just about we can force radio to play this so that these guys maybe can get rich from from publishing the songs or owning the masters. It's so we can build a whole industry. And that's, of course, what happened in 1971. And it was when of course, the very day I released Oh What a Feeling, which was perfect, planned, as soon as I knew the date. And it was something that we didn't know what the effect was going to be the day we did that. But then we, of course, saw there was a group of radio stations that Nevin Grant was the sort of key component of, that met every week. And there was a group of them across the country, like Wayne Bryant from Ched in Edmonton, Roy Hennessy at CKLG. All of these stations across the country would have a weekly release get-together, conference call, to decide on the records that they wanted to support from this Maple group. And of course, having the one record that came out on the day of, and because it was called Oh What a Feeling, because it was joyous, because it rocked, it was, one of those perfect storms. It was being at the right time, at the right place, and it did what it did.
Ronnie Hawkins was,
well, okay. I'll preface my comments by saying that 6 months into my partnership with Ronnie, it wasn't going where it was planned to go. And how it was planned was Ronnie was going to be the media spokesman and flagship for everything that we did as a label. He also was going to put money into the label. What happened then was Ronnie's career was resurrected by him being signed by Jerry Wexler to Atlantic to do another record for them. So his focus was completely taken away from what he was going to contribute to this label. And he wasn't coming through with the money either. So what happened was I approached him probably 6 to 9 months into the life of Daffodil Records, saying, Ronnie, this isn't working. He had given me his offices. So I was in the Hawk's Nest in Toronto, in his offices, using them. And obviously that was the upside of his investment, was providing me space for the label. But that was just me. It was only one person, it was me. But I said to him, it's not working. I'd like to buy you out. So we came to a figure, and I came up with the money, bought him out. And from that point forward, at the end of 1970, we were no longer partners. It did cause some sort of friction on my side with him because I felt frustrated and disappointed. On the other hand, in hindsight, I saw it was a revival for Ronnie of his career, and that was great. He had already done what he had done. He came to Canada. He had created these great groups, and most particularly the great group, the band. And so, from that point of view, nothing but respect. He and I were very different. I was an Englishman. He was a Southerner from Arkansas. And not saying that those two can't meet, and very often can and do, but they didn't really in our case. He was, I guess because he was so big and full of hype, color, and his one-liners, which were great. And before he died, I went to him and Wanda, his wife, because my wife came up with a great book title for a book that we wanted him to write, just as somebody who knew him and knew he was the king of the one-liners. And she said he should put this book together of all his stories and one-liners, but all of the really racy stuff, all of that, and it should be called Hawk Talk. HAWKTAWK, Hawk Talk. And I don't know what his reaction was, because I think it mostly came through wonder at that point to him. It didn't happen, and then, of course, he passed. And I did see him several times in the final years, and we always talked. We never had a problem talking together. And I guess because history was history, and hopefully he was respected the fact that I had gone on and created a great little label with some wonderful artists, and then obviously on into the business, so that there was that respect there. And we never actually worked together on anything after that. That was it. He did a lot for Canadian music. You can't deny that. And for Canadian musicians too, he was a tough taskmaster. I know that from the musicians of his I worked with, but he had an ear to find them and found great ones. And, you know, when I worked with Rick Bell before he went on to Janis Joplin's band, and Larry Atamanik, the drummer we had on that first King Biscuit Boy album, who went on to C-Train to Boston, and then on to Alice Cooper, and Joseph Charovsky, the keyboard player, who also went on to Alice Cooper. These were all musicians that came from the Ronnie School of Hard Knocks, and they learned their craft. They were incredible players, and it was a lot to do with him and being the hard taskmaster he was. So I really got to see the benefits musically of what he started.
You're in the doctor's office and someone's next to you, and they don't go, "What are you in for?" But they'll go, "Oh, what do you do?"
I guess it depends on the circumstances. I do almost always say I'm in the music industry. And, different people say, "Oh, that's interesting. So what do you do? Or how does it work?" And, I think that always depends on who you're talking to and the vibe you're getting from them as to how much you go down that road. And these conversations almost always become lengthy when you're a captive audience, such as you're on a flight somewhere. And there's no way around this. You're sitting next to that person. So usually I expand significantly. And I have to say that on 2 or 3 occasions, particularly in the United States, which is typical of Americans and why we love Americans, is that those conversations have expanded into something really interesting and meaningful, because Americans are open books. They're prepared to say anything about anything. And that encourages me as a more reserved Englishman to get a little bit more expansive in my comments. I opened up an office in Nashville in the 1990s. I started signing a number of great Nashville songwriters to my publishing company. And so it led to me saying, I need an office there. So I established one. And then I was going down frequently to Nashville. And on one of these trips, I'm sitting next to this guy, and we start talking, and we're on one of those, what did Bombardier, a regional jet, RJ, right? Bombardier made this RJ, which was a very small jet. In fact, it was bought privately by a lot of people around the world because it was small enough to be like a private jet, but big enough to take a number of people. So the route to Nashville, the direct route, Toronto-Nashville, was by RJ, Bombardier's regional jet. So I'm sitting next to this guy, and it's one class, so you don't know who you're sitting with. It's not like somebody's in first class, somebody's in economy, somebody's in business. No, we're all in the same class. And we get talking, and he's fascinated by the music industry. And he said, well, I live in the States and I live in Florida, and I have a place in Nassau, but I love Canada because I was born there. I was born in on the East Coast in Halifax, but I moved to America years ago, and so he's asking me about what business I'm in. So I'm explaining it, and he said, "Oh, you know, I've always been fascinated by the music industry and wondered about it and everything else," and he said, "I'm in gold," and it turns out he was the chairman of I Am Gold, which is one of the biggest gold makers, manufacturers, if you like, producers in the world. And as we're talking, we started talking more about the playing. He was, and you know, he was interested in the music side, but we digressed into. He said, "Have you ever been on the RJ before, the Bombardier RJ?" And I said, "Yeah, I have, because I take this plane to Nashville a lot." And he said, "You know, it's a great plane." And I said, "Well, I'm happy it is." But yeah, I mean, I've got no problems with it. I've never had a problem with it and everything else. And he said, "Well, I have one." And I said, "Well, how do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I have one privately. I bought one of the Bombardier RJs for myself and what I do." And then, of course, that led to him saying he was in gold. And so the reason for this story is that not long after, 2 or 3 months later, I'm traveling down with one of my signings, an artist, a young female called Lonnie Wallace. We're traveling down together to meet with a number of record labels in Nashville. I get onto the plane, the RJ, and who's on it but this same guy? And he says, "Frank, you know, I remember you from our trip a few months ago." "Yeah, great. I remember you too." And he said, "Well, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm taking this young female." She was maybe 21, very young, very talented. "I'm taking her down to Nashville to let some of the labels hear her and everything else." "Oh, that's great." Yeah, he was so, and you know, she was very attractive, so he was very charmed and warmed by the whole thing, spoke with her and everything else. So fast forward now a few more months, and I see him again. He's obviously on a regular route here, and as I was. And so we're now becoming virtually friends. And he said, "Well, what you been doing?" And I said, "Well, I launched this Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. And I'm going to have the first induction gala." And so this would have been 2002 or 3. "I'm going to have this first gala at the Glengoule Theatre in Toronto, just coming up, and we're going to induct Gordon Lightfoot and a number of other great songwriters and writers." And he said, "I'd love to come to that." And I said, "Well, let me buy 2 tickets for you, and we'd love to see you there." So we get to the gala. I'm awaiting his arrival. He arrives, and I meet him at the front where all the tickets are being given out, because I want to be sure he got in fine and everything else. And he hands me this envelope. And I say, "Oh, what's that?" And he said, "Well, I wanted to pay for the tickets. I feel it's more professional. I know you've put them by gratis for me, but I'd like to pay you for them." And I said, "Well, Mark, you don't have to do that. I was happy for you to be here and to..." "No, I insist," he said. So anyway, later on in the evening, when I had the chance, because it was a busy night, I would open up the envelope, expecting a check for $125, $150. I can't remember what the tickets were then, but for 2 tickets. And it was a huge sum of money. And it was, he made it out, as I wanted him to the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. And it was a great, as a non-profit organization, in our first year of induction, it was a lifesaver. It brought a tremendous cash flow into the organization, and I made him a patron of the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame for doing that. So then fast forward to the next gala. Of course, I invited him again. I said, no, you're not paying for the tickets. And he said, well, let me bring a couple of friends up with me. So he said, put by 3 or 4 tickets for me. And I said, of course, Mark. Put by 3 or 4. Well, the long and short of it is, he said, I'm coming from Nassau on my own plane, but I'm picking up somebody in Memphis and then coming on to your gala. So I said, oh, great. And who are you picking up in Memphis? And he said, Steve Crowbar. I went, Steve Crowbar?
I saw you introduce him. And you got him to stand up.
So that's Mark for you. And he also, at the same event, gave me another envelope. And I said, you're not paying for the tickets again, or anyway. And he said, well, Frank, I think it's a great organization. I think what you're doing is fantastic. So he gave me another 5-figure check, which, again, amazing. But that all stemmed from meeting somebody on the plane who was Americanized at that point. He was Canadian born, but who we got talking, and we divulged a lot of intimacies, if you like, what we do and who we are and everything. And that's what that led to. And I've had other examples of that over the years in different forms. Yeah, it's just so American, and that's part of what I love. Talent, Alfie. When I signed Surrender, and then I signed them on to Capitol through my production company, they were a brilliant band. They were really a very musician band. They were all about musicians, great players, like some of those American bands at the same time, whether you want to call it Steely Dan or any of those bands that were really all about the playing and what they produced. But I loved them. And so Alfie's there as the lead singer. But the irony is, he didn't think he could sing. He didn't think he should be the lead singer. And my wife, who is a trained singer and was a recording artist, and
I listened to her stuff last night.
Yeah, she said, Alfie, you've got to be kidding. You got a great voice. And he did. We loved his voice. And I loved it on that first album. Not Alfie. He didn't think he should be the lead singer. Anyway, you know the rest. He did. When Surrender was again dropped by Capitol way too early, after one album and an EP, then became Solo Alfie, and of course I was his publisher all those years following that. And incredible talent, great voice. He got better. His voice got better and better and better, and his playing got better again. Tremendous talent.
Tell me about Exchange. Did you meet them through Surrender?
Yes, it must have been both of them through Surrender. I'm just trying to remember the time periods here, but I would say yes.
And Gerald's the guy who became Anne Marie's musical director. It was Gerald, right?
No, Steve.
Steve, okay.
Steve Sexton became Anne Murray's. And Gerald was in a band called Night Winds that I loved. I published for a while. He was in a band called Rabbit,
I remember Rabbit.
WRABIT.
Yeah.
They were signed, I think they were signed to Warner's here, Rabbit. We always were really good friends. Gerald and I signed him as a songwriter. I didn't, not Steve, but I signed Gerald as a songwriter and published a lot of his material. He wrote one of my all-time favorite songs ever, Don't Hold Back Your Love, which Hall & Oates recorded. And the demo actually was done by a band. These will always lead, as they always, into a spider web of stories. But Surrender, Capitol wouldn't pick up Surrender. And it was a guy, you may know his name or may know him, Bobby Colomby. Bobby Colomby was in Blood, Sweat and Tears. He became head of A&R for Capitol in the US after Rupert Perry. Rupert Perry was hoisted up to president or whatever he was. Bobby was responsible for Surrender as an A&R guy there. He really loved them, thought they were terrific players, but there was something missing. I think it was the material for him. He felt that they never got commercial enough. He always talked about the band that he either signed or came from called Pages. And Pages.
Oh, Richard Page, yeah.
Richard Page, yeah. Who has a superlative voice, stellar voice. And eventually, Gerald, David Tyson, another writer I represented for years and years, I still do, and Richard got together and wrote this song, Don't Hold Back Your Love. And of course, you know, when you put Richard's voice on a great song, it's like going through the ceiling. Hall & Oates heard it because they were chosen to do the movie theme for, I think it was called Days of Thunder or something, a big movie back then. And they heard it because it had been submitted for the movie. Didn't make the movie, but Daryl Hall loved it and they recorded it. And it was a top 5 AC hit for them. But anyway, Gerald co-wrote that song, and he co-wrote a number of others that I published over many years. So Gerald's always in my mind when I'm thinking of musical things. That's why he joined the Leggett album for Illuminations, because he was the natural to be the keyboard player. And Steve, meanwhile, had a publishing catalog and then asked me to represent it for him. So I did. Steve was producing a number of different artists or involved in different projects. This probably was before Anne Murray, but it might have been the same time when he was beginning with her, because he had a long, long stay with Anne as her musical director and player. And anyway, he and Gerald were really good friends, so tight. And they came to me with this project. And they had written a couple of pieces for it. I loved it, same as you ended up doing. And I said, well, this should be an album and you should be a group. So we came up with the Exchange name and called it after that track. I helped them with a lot of the titles of their songs because they would write these pieces and then say, what do we call it? So I'd say, well, to me, that feels like you're going into the night. So it was like Into the Night, became Into the Night. And we did a lot of that together over the years. And I got them the record deal in California with Mesa Blue Moon, who released those albums. And suddenly they were taking off in that sort of new age, new wave era of new age music. And Mesa at the time had, do you remember Strands and Farrar?
Oh, yeah. I know all that stuff.
Yeah, I bet you do. So they had Strands and Farrar. So we thought this is perfect. You know, they were terrific. And yeah, we'd love to be with this label. So I did a deal with the owner of Mesa Blue Moon, and that created that career. And by the way, Gerald and I are talking about another album. So I go, great, about time. And so they'll be doing another one. I wasn't really that directly involved in the last couple because since then I'd sold my company. I didn't publish either of them anymore. So I sort of wasn't directly executive producer type person in their lives, just friends. And they'd always send me tracks. Hey, this is a track kind of come on the new album and all of this sort of thing. That's great. Just keep going because you make great music together. It's wonderful stuff.
Who surprised you through the years the most? Who was the biggest surprise for you?
All my artists and songwriters constantly pleasantly surprise me with their talent and with what they bring to the table. That it's more about, for me, you asked me earlier, you know, the ones that got away.
Yeah.
And obviously I mentioned Leggett and Illuminations, which is an album, definitely. Another one for me is Gus, the guitar player, who is Canadian, but we did much better in the US with him. He should have been a superstar. You know, some musicians are incredibly sophisticated, bright, intelligent. They have their lives outside of music too, but they, you know, and then you get those raw talents who are just about their music. There's nothing else. Gus was one of those, an absolutely brilliant guitar player, blazing guitar player. I've not heard anything quite like him. And I signed him, tried to sign him to Capitol. They passed. So I then went to the US and signed him to Nempra Records, which was an Epic distributed label. They had a guy called Steve Forbert, who was doing very well for them at the time. Nat Weiss, who owned Nempra, had been connected with the Beatles for many years. He was very involved in them coming to America, and he was a lawyer and a label owner. Anyway, I ended up signing Gus to them. He almost broke so big in America, it was ridiculous. He was everywhere for about 6 months. And there were various things that got in the way. We did a second album with Bob Seger's producer in Detroit, another great record. But the real thing for me with Gus, and why I call him one of the ones that got away, is he was Canadian. Epic Records here had the rights to him, but through the US deal I'd made, they did nothing with him, absolutely nothing at all. And he was making this extraordinary record, the first one called Convicted, and the second one. And they were doing nothing with him, and I just couldn't understand that. But that was a little bit of a digression because I just suddenly thought of him as one of the ones that got away. But and another aside, which because of your background on that smooth jazz side for a moment, I also signed. Do you know who Rick Braun is?
Oh God, yeah.
I signed Rick. I heard him with Sade. He was Sade's side man, playing trumpet. And he was introduced to me by a good friend, another instrumental artist from the States, who I also signed, got a deal for, a flute player called Steve Kujala. Also made brilliant records for CBS Masterworks. But Rick said to me, I have a good friend who's a trumpet player, plays backup for Sade. He makes great music himself. You should hear some of his stuff. So I said, okay, I'll go and check him out because Sade's coming into town. I did, met with him afterwards, loved it, signed him, got him a record deal again with Mesa Blue Moon.
Yeah.
He was the next artist I brought to them. And I mean, we had a string of massive new, I don't know, smooth jazz, whatever.
New adult contemporary, they were calling it back then. Remember?
Yeah.
NAC.
Yeah. That's it, NAC. And, you know, several number ones with Rick and all of that. So that was great. And then I also signed another interesting project to Mesa called Indaba. And it was South African music by a songwriter of mine called John Capek. And John Capek, we just inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame a couple of months ago with Mark Jordan. And this was a brilliant record that John had made in South Africa with a group of South African musicians, and it was called Indaba. And never saw the light of day. It was released, but didn't particularly do anything, but another brilliant record.
I just found out, by the way, because of Ian Thomas, looking up Ian Thomas and just I dived deep, and I didn't realize that was John playing the keyboards on Painted Ladies.
That's right.
That's crazy. I had no idea.
You know, as you know, I worked with Ian for several years, quite a number of years, got him his first 2 American record deals after that Janis one. So he did Painted Ladies, and then I got him his record deal for Calabash, the Calabash album, and then the Still Here album. And then I signed him to publishing during the whole Boomers era of his. So, Ian and I go back a long way.
How are you, as a publisher, involved in someone else doing Ian's songs?
With Ian, obviously, a lot of people, Chicago, Bette Midler, Santana, a whole pile of people were doing his songs. It's often a combination of things. It's getting their songs out there to A&R people. Sometimes they bite on them right away and say, I love it, I want it for so-and-so. Other times they say, there's some great songs in here, I'm going to hang on to them. And you don't know whatever's going to happen until one day you see it on a record. Then there is the sort of what I call the gang approach. If it's a writer, and Mark Jordan is a good example. Mark Jordan is a writer who for many years, all the A&R guys were checking out his songs. So that whenever he either put out a new album or they heard there was demo tapes around, all of the A&R guys were getting those tapes from a publisher, usually, if they were unreleased, and just picking them up as records if they were released. So those would often lead to a cut on a record. Sometimes it's the relationships with the artists themselves. You meet an artist and you go, do you know what? I've got a song that's perfect for you. I heard you were looking for the new album. Yeah, send it over. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I've got so many examples I had probably about 1,500 covers of my songs during my TMP company. So that was 14 years. I had that company, started it and sold it. And in that period, everyone has a different story. Some of them just come through the back door. You didn't even know the person had the song. You never sent it to them. Your artist or writer never mentioned it to them. And we suddenly get a call, will you license this song for so-and-so putting it out? And we go, well, yeah, but how did that happen? And make a book in itself to tell you about how some of these songs happen and get heard.
Is there a book?
There should be. I mean, there is. I am writing a book. It's not about that particular subject, but it will no doubt include some of that because of all of the songs we did get cut.
If anyone has to write a book, sir, you need to write a book.
Well, I've been trying to, John, for 10 years.
Are you too busy?
That's what the problem has been. I start, I stop, I start, I stop. I've got a lot of words written. I mean, like 250,000 words towards the book. But I need to collate it all into a proper form. I want to write it. I don't want a ghostwriter. It's me. And I need the time to put all of that together and complete it. But I've had a couple of publishers saying they'd like to publish it, but I can't put a date on when I'm going to get it done. So it's one of those things that sits in the background, and I think about frequently, because every day is a different story. And one day I'll actually get down and complete it.
John Cody to me is one of those albums. And I mean, I understand on some levels why it didn't come across, but there's not a bad track on that record. And to me, to this day, I listen to John Cody, that first album, and all his albums for that. Larry Klein produced a second album.
You did. Darkness Visible.
Yeah, Darkness Visible.
Yeah,
God,
yeah.
You have a good memory. God, you have good memory.
I published all of those, and from that record, one of the friends of Larry came in and decided to write a song one day with John, and that yielded the title track of Bonnie Raitt's album, Fundamental, which John co-wrote with that writer. Now, you see, there's an example. I didn't pitch that song to Bonnie Raitt. I didn't know anything about it till John says to me, here, I wrote this song with this LA writer. It's really good. And I hear Bonnie's interested in it. Well, obviously it was the co-writer was playing it to Bonnie, and she ends up doing it on a platinum album that it's the title track. So, you know, there's one of those examples. But how about on John Cody's album, the Mary Margaret O'Hara duet, Better Off This Way?
Haunting.
Incredible.
Haunting. Goosebumps.
I know, absolutely goosebumps on that song. I mean, it's a beautiful duet, and I was amazed. Again, it was one of those things, it was signed through an independent label, through MCA distributing. They just didn't get it. He was too artistic for them. They wanted something straight down the middle, mainstream. They couldn't deal with, excuse me, a Tom Waits type record, which is what John is. He's a Tom Waits type artist. They didn't know how to market, promote it, or anything. But as John may have told you, he is just completing his latest album, which I'm publishing and going to look after. Yep.
I really hope you enjoyed that. What a plethora of information from Frank Davies. He has been one of my Canadian music heroes for a heck of a lot of years. I've followed his career for so many decades and finally got a chance to meet him with this interview. Hope you enjoyed it. In the next few weeks, we'll be putting out more clips from this entire video with specific chapters. Remember, if you want to help the channel, there's a PayPal donation link right at the very top of the description. You can join our Patreon and you'll get early access to our videos. And why not buy a Rock History Canada t-shirt, hat, cap, and many other articles of clothing with our logo on it. Subscribe to our channel, share our videos, comment on them, and like them. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Canada. Take care.